Hey guys, welcome to the channel Dit Commando. Today we're going to be reacting to an infographics video. The infographics show why kamikaze attacks failed against the British during World War II. So I thought they were quite effective from the footage that I've seen, but I guess, overall they did obviously fail. But we'll find out today, guys. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you're brand new here, and let's get into it.
Sirens scream as British sailors run across the aircraft carrier deck. Japanese kamikaze planes are inbound. Anti-aircraft guns fire into the sky. Planes are launched from the deck. Sailors dive for cover. An enemy plane goes down, then another and another. The sky is filled with explosions, but out of the smoke comes a horrible sight. One of the kamikaze pilots has made it through. The plane dives. The bombs on the underside of the aircraft reflect the gleam of sunlight. The kamikaze plane slams into the aircraft carrier's deck. There's a huge explosion. Fire streams across the runway. Sailors sprint with hoses to put out flames. When they're under control, the mechanics and engineers look over the ship. It's relatively unscathed. With a few quick repairs, the carrier is once again ready for battle. Nothing.
Tell you something though, you must have been petrified living during that time and then being conscribed to war, especially in the Navy. The conditions were horrendous, troops, okay? Completely different to what they are now in the Royal Navy. They were ruthless back then. If you didn't follow the rules or whatnot, you were severely punished. And yeah, not to mention kamikaze pilots aiming directly for you. Scary, scary times indeed.
Is going to stop the British Pacific Fleet, not even Japan's most deadly kamikaze pilots. As World War II progressed and Allied forces started gaining ground in Europe, a decision was made to turn their attention to the threat in the Pacific. The Japanese were invading parts of mainland Asia and wreaking havoc on the United States' bases and fleets in the eastern part of the world. With Nazi Germany slowly falling apart and Allied forces closing in on all sides, it was clear that more resources needed to be deployed to the Pacific to aid in the battle against the Japanese. The British had lost ships to the Japanese earlier in the war. Less than 3 days after Japan entered World War II in December of 1941, they destroyed several British ships in the Pacific.
Whoa.
The Japanese aircraft sank the Prince of Wales and Repulse, two of the most powerful Royal Navy vessels. After the loss of the British ships and many sailors' lives.
Right, so that's a big hit to England, to Great Britain. All right, to lose the Prince of Wales ship, one of the biggest in its class at the time. That's going to put a massive dampener on morale, guys. Okay, and the Japanese were gaining quite a bit of momentum around the eastern shores at the time. As I mentioned, they were going and attacking certain sovereign territories to the United States, and yeah, they were just causing all sorts of trouble, and they were quite good at it as well.
Japan attacked and captured naval bases in Hong Kong and Singapore, basically driving any British presence out of the Pacific Ocean indefinitely. The British were too focused on fighting in Europe at the time to send supplies and ships back to the Pacific. But in August of 1943, at the Quadrant Conference of Allied leaders in Quebec, the Allies agreed that more resources and ships should be sent to the Pacific. The Allied forces still maintained a Germany-first principle, thereby cutting off the head of the Axis powers. But Japan was posing a real threat to an Allied victory to end the war. The Pacific was of strategic importance for Allied forces for multiple reasons, one of which was the oil-rich areas of Sumatra. Then, in September of 1944, at the Second Quebec Conference, a finalized plan to launch the British Navy back into the waters of the Pacific was formed. Britain offered to send a fleet of ships, including at least 4 aircraft carriers, to the Pacific waters by the end of 1944. The stipulation was that the United States welcomed the help, but the British forces needed to be self-sufficient, as the U.S. was already struggling to maintain their footholds and supply chains in the Pacific as it was. Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser was appointed the commander of the newly designated British Pacific Fleet, and ships were sent to the Japanese-controlled waters. The British Pacific Fleet set up its main base of operations in Australia. It took a long time for the men, materials, and ships to travel the 12,000 miles from Britain to Australia, but the support that the British Pacific Fleet would provide was vital to defeating the Japanese and ending World War II. The fleet was already planning to sustain itself, since most British ships, weapons, and planes differed from what the Americans were using. The differences in the British Pacific Fleet was actually one of the things that made it so successful. The United States was struggling to defend their ships and bases against the kamikaze pilots in the Japanese Air Force, and although kamikaze planes posed a threat to the British ships, the way the vessels were designed allowed them to stand out better to kamikaze attacks compared to.
Right, so I wonder if that design was by a flaw, or was it by accident, or was it done on purpose? I mean, the technology back in the day, bearing in mind the Royal Navy at the time was still quite dominant in its abilities, and it was coming off that fantastic history as well that the Royal Navy possesses. 1940, was that design done on purpose for kamikaze pilots? I guess not. I mean, was this the first time we seen this type of attack? I think it was, wasn't it? It was the first time kamikazes was used on a mass scale anyway.
To their American counterparts. Specifically, aircraft carriers in the British Pacific Fleet had armored decks, which greatly reduced the damage caused by kamikaze impacts. It wasn't long after the fleet had docked in Australia and made final preparations that they were called into action by Admiral Nimitz. Their mission was to attack and destroy key Japanese-controlled oil refineries. This was an important objective, but more than anything else, Nimitz wanted to see what the new British Pacific Fleet was capable of. It did not disappoint. On January 24, 1945, the British Pacific Fleet attacked the refinery at Plagio. They destroyed it and moved on to the second target at Songi-Gerong 5 days later. Using planes launched from aircraft carriers, the British Pacific Fleet was able to destroy both refineries with relative ease. This slowed the supply of oil being used to fuel the Japanese warships and aircraft.
Yeah, if you cut the oil off, you cut the food off, you basically suffocate a military. If you suffocate a military, you eventually suffocate the nation, hypothetically speaking. So you take away the fuel, all right, the food, that kind of thing, then your days are numbered. And how effectively you can do that can actually speed the situation up. So Britain was involved in quite an important push during that period, it seems, in taking these oil refineries out. It's quite an amazing thing to get involved with pretty early on.
First mission had not only dealt a blow to the Japanese Navy, but the rest of the Japanese war machine as well, including the ability to launch kamikaze attacks. It did not stop Japan entirely, but it was a start. Unfortunately, a delay between the two attacks allowed Japanese forces to organize a defense around the Songi-Gerong. On January 29th, enemy forces located the British Pacific Fleet and tried to stop them from destroying the second oil refinery. As the fleet approached their target, Japanese fighters took off from a nearby airbase. In response, combat air patrol fighters took off from the aircraft carriers in the British Pacific Fleet. They met the...
How scary must it have been for these Japanese fighters? You know, again, it's a horrendous thing, all right? I'm not taking any sides, but you've just got to look at the level of the mindset involved in these individuals to be able to go and do those missions knowing that they're not going to return. They are pretty much ending their own lives in the protection of their country and the emperor. I don't know, it's a scary mindset.
Japanese planes en route and destroyed all of them before they could cause any significant damage. Any kamikaze pilots that were planning to fly into the ships of the British Pacific Fleet were shot down before they could reach their target. However, 16 British planes were lost during the battle. The pilots gave their lives to protect the fleet so it could carry out its mission of destroying one of the major oil supplies fueling the Japanese forces. After the completion of their mission, the British Pacific Fleet returned to Sydney. Luckily, the maintenance carrier Unicorn had just arrived with replacement aircraft. The lost planes were replenished, and the fleet was ready for its next mission. The success of the British Pacific Fleet's first assignment caused Admiral Nimitz to insist that the fleet be used as a flexible reserve for vital missions occurring across the Pacific. The next mission was Operation Iceberg, also known as the Battle of Okinawa. The fleet was tasked with intercepting any aircraft, including kamikazes, trying to reach Okinawa. To do this, the British Pacific Fleet launched attacks on airfields on the Sakishima Islands. On the day of the landing on Okinawa by Allied forces, the British Pacific Fleet was on guard to stop any Japanese planes trying to leave their sector. The Japanese launched a series of attacks on the ships patrolling the waters, but planes from the aircraft carriers intercepted them. Intense dogfighting occurred over the open ocean. Then, out of the thick of the battle came a kamikaze plane. It broke the line of defenses and crashed directly into the Indefatigable. This was the first British aircraft carrier to be struck by a kamikaze plane. Kamikaze attacks normally had devastating consequences, but after only a few hours of repairs, the Indefatigable was able to launch and land aircraft once again. This would not be the last.
That's it. They've underestimated the British in that respect, and having the armored the armored airstrip surfaces on the ships there, and they just haven't been effective at all, which is quite good to know that those Brits were doing a good job out there.
Time, a vessel of the British Pacific Fleet was struck by a kamikaze. During the battles to maintain control over the waters and airspace around the British Pacific Fleet, every single one of the aircraft carriers would be hit by kamikazes, yet none of the impacts would cause critical damage. What made the British Pacific Fleet so resistant to kamikaze attacks? A lot of it had to do with the pilots and planes stationed on the aircraft carriers. They would take out enemy planes before they could reach the fleet. The expert pilots maneuvered their planes into attack positions and put them...
So it wasn't just the design of of the ships. It was actually the professionalism of the British pilots as well, and their ability, their sheer ability and skill set to be able to take out these pilots before they even reached the ships, which I'd imagine would be quite a hard task. Anyone knows anything about flying, which I don't profess to know an awful lot on, but I've watched a good few documentaries. Strid's pilot is one of them. It's not an easy thing to be, all right, a good pilot. It's a very hard thing to be just an average pilot, never mind a war fighting pilot. It's a completely different level of skill set, guys. So I'm proud of the Brits in this respect.
Themselves between kamikaze pilots in the fleet, but kamikazes did get through, and they did strike the British ships. However, the British vessels had armored decks that helped them prevent damage by kamikaze attacks that would otherwise have incapacitated them. The reinforced decks allowed the aircraft carriers to sustain damage from kamikaze impacts and still remain in action. For example, the collision on the deck of the Indefatigable could have caused a massive hole in a non-armored ship deck, but instead the Indefatigable deck only dented about 3 inches. There was a large fire, but the crew quickly got it under control and immediately started repairing the ship, so it would be combat ready in just a matter of hours. The amount of damage the British Pacific Fleet could sustain impressed the United States. About a week after the Indefatigable shrugged off the kamikaze attack, the U.S. aircraft carrier called the Hancock was struck by a Japanese plane. The Hancock was so badly damaged it had to return to the United States for repairs. The United States had so much faith in the British Pacific Fleet and its armored aircraft carriers that they were sent to strike vitally important airfields on the island of Formosa. The thought was that since the British ships were holding up so well against Japanese forces and their kamikaze pilots, that they would be less vulnerable to counterattacks. The operation to destroy Japanese targets on Formosa was a huge success. The British Pacific Fleet wiped out planes, airfields, and railways. After Formosa, the fleet resupplied and headed back to battle. The British Pacific Fleet engaged Japanese forces once again, and this time ran into some trouble. A kamikaze made it through the fleet's defenses and slammed into an aircraft carrier called the Formidable. Just before...
Right, so the Brits, we've been struck by a first kamikaze that's actually made any kind of significant difference to the warship. I'm hoping that Formidable doesn't sink, but I guess we'll find out in a few seconds. And it's interesting to point out in this, guys, as well. So modern day deployments, depending on the scenario, normally last 6 to 9 months, a little bit longer for certain elements of the military. And I'm talking, you know, pretty much the UK military, the US military. Deployments have a time frame, all right, and then you're reshuffled and resupplied with different men and women. But back in this day when the Royal Navy was out fighting wars on the 7 seas, you know, they didn't have an end game. They didn't have an exit strategy. It was literally, we're going on deployment, and when the war's over, that's when we'll leave. So it just shows you the type of characters that we're dealing with. We're dealing with people who are very, very equipped and apt, and, you know, they're living their job day by day, which I'd respect greatly.
Before the kamikaze hit, it released a 500-pound bomb onto the deck. It was enough to put a 2-foot hole in the flight deck of the carrier. However, later that day, the crew was able to plug the hole and resumed flights from the carrier. Once again, the British Pacific Fleet seemed to be resistant to Japan's most deadly tactics. Later in the mission, a group of 4 kamikazes made it through the fleet's defenses and struck the HMS Victorious. The first kamikaze smashed into the flight deck and knocked out the carrier's catapult. The second committed to a dive, but Captain Michael Denny quickly ordered evasive actions, causing the plane to hit the aft deck and bounce off into the ocean. The third kamikaze was taken out by an anti-aircraft gun before it could reach the ship. The last kamikaze hit its target. The plane caused the most damage. When it crashed into the Formidable, it took out 18 aircraft that were parked on the aft deck, destroying them. Even with 4 kamikazes...
Right, that's a major hit then, guys. That's a major hit. 18 or so aircraft taken out of the game. That pretty much weakens that ship, its ship's capability massively.
Making it through to the Formidable, the ship sustained only minor damage, another testament to the kamikaze resistance of the British Pacific Fleet. During Operation Iceberg, the fleet spent 62 days at sea, launched planes 5,335 times to defend the Pacific Fleet, dropped 1,000 tons of bombs, and shot 500,000 rounds of ammunition. The British Pacific Fleet destroyed 42 enemy aircraft in the air and more than 100 on the ground. This prevented Japanese planes and kamikaze missions from reaching the United States forces at Okinawa.
Okay, so that's a major amount of capability being taken away from the Japanese right there, all because of the British intervention, courtesy of the United States getting us involved in that theatre at the time.
The British Pacific Fleet had already accomplished so much and resisted numerous kamikaze attacks, but they were not done yet. The squadron was split up and the carriers were destined to be a vital part of Operation Olympic, which was the first phase of the invasion of Japan. The Special Task Force of the British Pacific Fleet ships dropped hundreds of tons of bombs. The planes from the carriers flew 416 defensive missions to protect both the British and US forces. The ships had to sail through rough water and even typhoons, but continued their support of the Allied forces so they could take the mainland of Japan. The British Pacific Fleet destroyed countless enemy planes, ships, and bases up until the Japanese surrendered on September 2, 1945. Without the support of the British Pacific Fleet, the war in the Pacific may have lasted much longer. The British ships were especially effective at resisting kamikaze planes, one of Japan's most deadly tactics. It was due to the extra armor on the ship's decks and the expertise of the pilots that launched from the aircraft carriers of the British Pacific Fleet that allowed them to fend off the kamikaze attacks and complete their missions. Now watch, what was it like to be a kamikaze pilot?
Right then, troops, let's have a little bit of a chat with that one then. So, why did kamikaze attacks fail against the British during World War II? I think the main reason for that is it's not just the armoured aircraft decks on top of the ships where it pretty much made it impenetrable. I would definitely say the skill set, the expertise, and the experience. I think experience is the one that catches a lot of people out. You might not have the greatest infrastructure or anything like that, but experience of warfighting is something that the British at that time especially had a lot of experience doing, especially the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy is the senior service in the British Armed Forces, and you can say what you want about the Royal Navy. They've been around forever. They've formed originally for some quite harsh taskings. If you look into the history of why the Royal Navy actually formed originally, these guys are tough, okay, and the experience says an awful lot. And the Japanese, they just didn't have the experience, I believe, to be able to mix it up with the British and the rest of the forces that were allied with us at the time. So this video makes me quite proud. It showcases the Royal Navy in a good way. And hopefully you guys enjoyed my reaction to the Infographics video. If you do, please go follow them, give them a subscribe. The link is in the description. Give me a like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video, guys. See you later.